How do you react when you discover your passenger destroyed your family's life? Luis Martinez was halfway to O'Hare Airport when he noticed the real estate photos on his passenger's phone screen. The house looked familiar, then terrifyingly recognizable. It was 1247 West 18th Street, his childhood address in Pilsen. His passenger, David Sterling, was reviewing demolition permits for the entire block. The same block where Luis's family had lived for 15 years before being forced out by developers exactly like the man sitting in his back seat. The Chicago skyline glittered in the distance as Luis Martinez navigated his taxi through the late evening traffic. At 34, he had been driving nights for Sterling Cab Company for 8 years, a job that paid enough to support his elderly parents while he finished his engineering degree at community college. The work was steady, if not glamorous, picking up businessmen from downtown restaurants, ferrying tourists between hotels and attractions, occasionally dealing with drunk passengers who treated him like he was invisible. Luis had grown used to being invisible. In his taxi, he was just a pair of hands on the wheel and a voice asking for destinations. Passengers talked around him, through him, sometimes about him as if he couldn't understand English. He'd learned to tune out most conversations, to focus on traffic and navigation while his fares conducted business deals or personal dramas in his back seat. But tonight's passenger was different. David Sterling had climbed into the taxi outside an upscale steakhouse in the Loop, dressed in an expensive suit and carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Luis made in a month. He'd given an address near O'Hare Airport with the clipped efficiency of someone used to being driven around. Business or pleasure? Luis had asked, making the small talk that sometimes led to better tips. Business, Sterling replied, already pulling out his phone. Real estate development. Always more deals to review. Luis nodded and focused on navigating the evening traffic. Sterling seemed absorbed in his phone, occasionally taking calls about financing and permit approvals. The kind of high-level business conversations that reminded Luis of the gap between his current life and the dreams he'd once had. Growing up in Pilsen, Chicago's vibrant Mexican-American neighborhood, Luis had dreamed of becoming an architect. He'd spent hours sketching buildings, redesigning his family's small house in his imagination, planning the structures he'd build someday. His parents, Roberto and Carmen Martinez, had immigrated from Guadalajara when Luis was 5, working multiple jobs to afford their modest 2-story home at 1247 West 18th Street. That house had been everything to the Martinez family. Roberto had painted it bright blue, Carmen had planted flowers in the tiny front yard, and Luis had measured his growth against the doorframe in the kitchen. It was where he'd learned English, where he'd studied for his SATs, where his parents had dreamed their son would bring his own children someday. But dreams had collided with reality in 2015. Property values in Pilsen began skyrocketing as developers discovered the neighborhood's proximity to downtown and its stock of historic buildings. Longtime residents found themselves facing property tax bills they couldn't afford on working-class incomes. The Martinez family, like many of their neighbors, had been forced to choose between keeping their home and financial survival. They'd sold to a development company for far less than the house was worth, but more than they owed on their mortgage. It had seemed like a blessing at the time, enough money to move to a smaller place in Little Village and pay off some debts. But Luis had watched from their new apartment as bulldozers demolished not just their house, but their entire block, replacing family homes with luxury condominiums that cost more per month than his parents made in a year. 30 minutes to the airport, Luis said, checking his GPS as they merged onto the expressway. Perfect, Sterling replied, not looking up from his phone. Gives me time to review these property assessments. Luis glanced in the rearview mirror and felt his stomach drop. Sterling's phone screen was displaying real estate photos, and one of them showed a house that Luis recognized with the clarity of a lightning strike. Blue siding, small front porch, narrow driveway. It was 1247 West 18th Street. His child at home. But that was impossible. The house had been demolished years ago. Luis had driven past the empty lot just months after his family moved out, seeing only concrete foundations and scattered debris where his bedroom used to be. "Excuse me," Luis said, his voice carefully neutral, but I couldn't help noticing the photos on your phone. Is that property in Pilsen? Sterling looked up, slightly annoyed at the interruption. Yes, actually. We're expanding our development footprint in that area. Great investment potential. Still some original housing stock that hasn't been renovated yet. Luis felt a chill. That blue house. What's the address on that one? Let me check, Sterling said, swiping through documents. 1247 West 18th Street. Small property, probably built in the 1940s. We're planning to acquire it and several others on the block for a mixed-use development. The words hit Luis like a physical blow. But that house was torn down years ago. I drove past the lot myself. Sterling frowned and checked his phone again. No, you must be thinking of a different address. We just had this property appraised last week. Current owner is an elderly woman named. He scrolled through documents. Carmen Martinez. Lives there with her husband Roberto, both in their 70s. Luis nearly swerved into the next lane. Carmen and Roberto Martinez. His parents. But that was impossible. They'd sold that house and moved to Little Village. He'd helped them pack, had watched them sign the papers at the title company. Are you sure about that address? Luis asked, his voice shaking. Positive. In fact, we've been trying to contact the Martinez family for months to make an offer, but they haven't responded to our letters. Some of these older residents get suspicious of developers, understandably. Luis pulled into the right lane, his mind racing. How could his parents still own their old house? They'd sold it, he was certain. But then why would Sterling have current appraisal documents showing them as the owners? Mr. Sterling, Luis said carefully, the Martinez family you mentioned, have you seen them? Spoken to them? No. All our contact has been through letters sent to the property address. Why do you ask? A terrible possibility was forming in Luis's mind. What if his parents had never actually sold the house? What if the company that claimed to buy it had somehow defrauded them? His parents' English wasn't perfect, and they trusted the smooth-talking representatives who'd come to their door with promises of fair market value and quick closing. Mr. Sterling, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me. The development company that's been acquiring properties in Pilsen, what's the name? Sterling Development Group. My company. We've been working that neighborhood for about 5 years now, very successfully. Luis felt sick. Sterling Development Group was the same company that had supposedly bought his parents' house. The same company whose representatives had convinced Roberto and Carmen that selling was their only option with rising property taxes. Mr. Sterling, Luis said, pulling off at the next exit instead of continuing to the airport. I think we need to talk. What are you doing? I have a flight to catch. The Martinez family at 1247 West 18th Street. They're my parents. And they think they sold that house to your company 3 years ago. Sterling went very quiet. That's not possible. They signed papers. They were paid money. They moved out and found a new place. But you're telling me they still own the house. Look, there must be some misunderstanding. My company handles dozens of property acquisitions. I can't keep track of every detail. But Luis was no longer listening politely. He was remembering details from that painful day 3 years ago, how the representatives had insisted on meeting at a coffee shop instead of title company, how they'd rushed his parents through signing documents they didn't fully understand, how the check had been drawn on an account from a company Luis had never heard of. Mr. Sterling, I think your company defrauded my parents. I think you convinced them to sign papers giving you some kind of legal claim to their property without actually buying it. That's a serious accusation. Then let's find out if it's true. Luis drove straight to Pilsen instead of the airport, ignoring Sterling's protests about missing his flight. 20 minutes later, they pulled up in front of 1247 West 18th Street. The house was exactly as Luis remembered it, but in terrible condition. The blue paint was peeling, the front porch was sagging, and several windows were boarded up. It looked abandoned, which explained why Sterling thought the property was vacant. But Luis knew better. His parents were too proud to let their home deteriorate like this unless something was seriously wrong. He knocked on the front door while Sterling waited in the taxi, clearly uncomfortable with the turn the evening had taken. Luis's father, Roberto, answered the door, looking older and more frail than Luis remembered. His eyes widened when he saw his son. Mijo, what are you doing here? We told you not to come around here anymore. Dad, what do you mean? And why does the house look like this? Roberto glanced nervously at the taxi where Sterling was visible through the windshield. We can't talk about this, Luis. The lawyer said if we discuss it with anyone, we'll lose everything. What lawyers, Dad? What's going on? Carmen appeared behind her husband, looking equally distressed. Luis, you shouldn't be here. If they see you talking to us, they'll say we violated the agreement. What agreement? Roberto looked around nervously, then stepped outside and closed the door behind him. In whispered Spanish, he explained what had happened after Luis thought they'd sold the house. The representatives from Sterling Development Group had indeed paid them money, but not to buy the house. They'd convinced Roberto and Carmen to sign what they thought was a sale agreement, but was actually a lease-back arrangement with an option for the company to purchase the property at a future date. Under the terms of this predatory contract, Roberto and Carmen had received an upfront payment, but were required to pay rent to continue living in their own home. The rent started low but increased each year, and they were responsible for all maintenance and repairs. If they missed a payment or violated any terms of the agreement, Sterling Development could evict them and claim full ownership of the property. We've been paying rent for 3 years to live in our own house, Roberto said bitterly. And we can't afford to keep up with the repairs, but the contract says if we don't maintain the property, they can take it anyway. Why didn't you tell me this? Luis asked, horrified. Because we were ashamed, Carmen said, joining them on the porch. We thought we were smart enough not to be fooled, but they used so many legal words, and they said if we didn't sign quickly, the property taxes would force us into foreclosure anyway. Luis felt rage building in his chest. His elderly parents had been trapped in a predatory contract designed to strip them of their home while making it look legal. He walked back to the taxi, where Sterling was making increasingly urgent phone calls about missing his flight. Get out, Luis said. Excuse me. Get out of my taxi. You're not going to the airport. You can't just abandon a fare in the middle of nowhere. Watch me. Sterling looked around at the neighborhood he'd been systematically destroying and apparently decided not to push the issue. He gathered his belongings and stepped out of the taxi. My lawyers will hear about this, he said. Mine will hear about it first, Luis replied. And so will every Spanish-language news station in Chicago. Luis spent the next several hours with his parents, reviewing the predatory contract they'd signed and documenting the fraud. He called every lawyer he could find who specialized in elder abuse and real estate fraud. Most importantly, he called his cousin Miguel, who worked as an investigative reporter for Univision. The story that emerged over the following weeks was bigger than just one family's home. Sterling Development Group had used similar tactics on dozens of elderly homeowners throughout Pilsen, creating a pattern of systematic fraud targeting the neighborhood's immigrant population. Luis's taxi ride with David Sterling became the key evidence in a class-action lawsuit that ultimately resulted in criminal charges against Sterling and the return of illegally acquired properties to their rightful owners. 6 months later, Luis drove past 1247 West 18th Street and saw his father painting the house bright blue again, just like it had been in his childhood. Carmen was planting new flowers in the front yard, and the boarded windows had been replaced with glass that sparkled in the afternoon sun. Luis had quit driving taxi and was working for a nonprofit legal aid organization, helping other families navigate the complex world of real estate fraud. His engineering degree would have to wait, but he'd found a different way to build something meaningful. You know what's funny? Luis said to his parents over dinner in their restored home. If Sterling hadn't been so arrogant about reviewing those property photos in my taxi, he might have gotten away with it. Carmen said simply. What goes around comes around. In this case, Roberto added, karma came around in a taxi. Luis smiled, thinking about all the passengers he'd driven over the years, all the conversations he'd overheard, all the times he'd been invisible to the people whose lives he was briefly part of. Sometimes being invisible was a disadvantage, but sometimes it was exactly what you needed to see the truth. David Sterling was convicted of fraud and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. Sterling Development Group was dissolved, and their illegal contracts were voided. But more importantly, A community that had been under siege by predatory developers fought back and won. And Luis Martinez learned that sometimes the most important trip you can take as a taxi driver isn't getting your passenger where they want to go. It's stopping the journey when you realize where it's really headed.